Hi everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today we're back to a familiar format again with a Speedpaint that's going to be for a project going on in the background. I have spoken a little bit about that project, but I don't doubt that it will come up again later given how much I have been drawing for this as of late, but also given how much it ties into this idea as well for today. But since there isn't much need for a delay here, let's just look at the drawing itself then, shall we? So then, where did this idea come from? That is the usual starting point that I like to take with these things, so it seems like the best place to start with this one as well, even if it might be a little bit more of a complex answer compared to usual. I mean, usually, the answer to this question is that the idea seemed fun, or it came from a dream, or something generally along those lines. I might have a single idea to explore when it comes more to painting, or maybe a theme that I like to interpret. But with ideas like this, it often is that it simply seems entertaining or fun more than anything else, and that's all that really needs to be considered for it. Magic and fantasy is often something that I do just like drawing, with very little meaning beyond that. Yet, much like my last speed paint, I actually have somewhere that this idea comes from today, and it is the same place as the last idea as well. You see, for anyone unaware, I also adore writing and storytelling just as much as I do art. When it comes to reading, I enjoy it for the right moment, or if I have the right book. Now, I am also rather particular when it comes to stories that I enjoy reading, so it can be quite hard finding books that I like or that I do get heavily invested in, which, considering how much I like writing and making stories, seems pretty strange even to myself. But that isn't kind of the point here, so I'm going to try and stay a little bit more on track this time. Writing is one of those things that I just adore. I have mixed it in with my art a fair few times and in a fair few ways, whether it be that a drawing stems from a short written prompt that I made myself, or if the drawing itself is meant to tell a story. I've kind of always seen the two as connected in a sense, as one often feeds off the other, and then they also both fuel one another at the same time. So I have written things before that I keep to myself, but I have also been working in the background lately. Now, I know that I've said lately, but this one started as a small thing quite a few years ago. I had an idea a while ago for a story that would be set in a fantasy world when I was talking with one of my friends who reads a lot more than I do. I ended up writing a first draft, making some notes about how I could improve it, as I was never quite happy with it. And then I moved on to another project that I liked more at the time. I now understand that a lot of my issues with this version of the project had been the world building though. At the time I was more focused on the characters and the plot, so I never really thought about what would make the world unique or interesting in a sense. I was just focused on building that area of the world and this one kingdom, rather than thinking beyond that. And I did that at the time because only the kingdom was needed. I didn't need a world entirely, I just needed a kingdom. But it kind of made it a bit more detrimental to the story as a whole. By trying to only focus on one thing of many, it became a very generic fantasy world, where the magic wasn't too thought out, and that was that. It was flat, boring, and the characters also had their own issues at the same time, but again, the issues kind of all stemmed from the fact that I hadn't considered the way that this kingdom was affected by the world as a whole. And even the magic system was pretty basic at the time. And I was really just more focused on telling this story, and it worked better in a fantasy setting, as that was the idea I had. So, I later revisited it when I was thinking of maybe tying my stories into this channel here, and those videos are now unlisted for a multitude of reasons, but the underlying factor is that I'm just not happy with it anymore. But the issues that presented themselves this time was the world yet again. I focused more on making it interesting, and in the process of doing so, I almost entirely changed the story that I was trying to tell. The characters were different, and it just wasn't the same as what I'd been going for, or what I'd been aiming to do. I didn't know where I was taking it the more I was writing it, and it just stopped making sense to even me, and I was the one working on it. So I left it again. Then I suppose you know the saying that the third time's a charm. This time I took a full step back from that one, and I also brought more stories and ideas to look at. I have had fancy ideas scattered between notes for a while now that range in all sorts of lengths and size and scale. I have ideas that would cover a total of 2 sides of A4 paper, and some that, with the right planning, could take multiple books to explore and address. Yet they all seem to fall at the first hurdle, and that was why I never got invested in any of them, and never really did anything with them other than note it down for a later day. Their worlds were simply flat, generic, and I could only do so much for them with what I was focusing on at the time. Yes, maybe 1 or 2 hinged on unique details in the world, or used them as part of the plot. But most were interesting stories, placed in uninteresting worlds. I knew what to do for the world building though. It is one of those things that I find oddly enjoyable if I am ever bored. But I never quite built up enough of one world before I got the next idea, and they ended up in this sort of purgatory where I never did anything else with the ideas. They also would end up stuck there if I again got trapped into thinking I just had to work on this one area, and I almost forced the worlds to stay in this one area. I can't really explain it in a clear way, but I would never let the worlds expand beyond what I wanted them to be. So they were always dull. This is then where we go back to the drawing yet again and its origin. I mean, if the world was something that I commonly had issues with for all of the stories or characters, and I started to feel like they only existed in proximity to the main characters, why not solve all of it in one complicated and long step? So, in the background, I have been doing just that, by building one world that I can have multiple stories exist within, so I can do a lot more with it and not get stuck. Now, it is something that I have been working on for a while, and yes, there is still a lot left to work out when something is of this scale. But at the same time, I am at a point where I have been able to start working on certain areas and actually begin to write out parts of some stories that are going to be much better than any previous attempt. You see, my logic with this project is that every character, city, or thing within the world should and could, in theory, have their own story told from their perspective. They aren't to exist in a vacuum, and any main characters are simply people that the story is choosing to focus on for the most information to be provided. They will be the main character of their story, but any side character could have 1,000 other things going on at that very same time, that, if the stories were theirs, would be the main focus. And honestly, this would be a bit overkill if I were just using this world for a single story. I know far more about characters that I don't really need to know about them for their initial intent, but it has been helpful and good to know, especially for giving them a sense of being and character beyond just a role in the background. They're becoming complex in their own sense, rather than just a cardboard cutout serving a narrative purpose, and then returning to the storage facility until it's next needed. But that is also what I have been enjoying about a world like this. One character leads to another, and then they all lead to another, and before you really know it, there is another story waiting to be told, simply by exploring who these side characters are within this world. This drawing then stems from a character within the world, and the world as a whole. See, this part is the part that I don't think I'll be giving too much information about, since all of this is still a work in progress, and it is something that I also want to reveal more about, gradually, and as part of the world and stories. But this entire character's existence kind of stemmed from when I named one of the world's areas and started to think about its history. She kind of forms as a character before I could even tell you. Before I knew it, I had a sense of personality, a name, and the starting shadows of a backstory and a future for her, all before I ever thought that I was ready to work on the characters to begin with. Now, she will be included much later in the video. I mean, I did work on this drawing a bit strangely when I stepped back to actually think about it, but I also didn't mind the way I did this too much. The background is of the environment of this character, and then the drawing as a whole goes towards the next part of the world building project, which is then where it's all originated from as well for now. It's also where a range of other ideas have come from recently that I am slowly working through. But I actually want to talk about how I worked on this drawing now, since it is really strange for me to do anything like this here. You see, usually, when I'm drawing a character within a space, I draw them together and at the same time. I wouldn't separate it like I did here, and even if the character got their own folder in the process, I wouldn't still separate them. They would still be drawn within the space like another object in the space. I wouldn't draw the background behind them where they were going to be sat, and I certainly wouldn't spend time shading something that would just later get covered up given the amount of time that it would then typically take. It just really makes no sense for me to shade something that nobody else is going to see but myself. For this drawing, however, I wanted the complete background and the complete character to be able to be entirely separated without it leading to missing information or details that would need to be covered if I moved them. It ties into noting purposes, yes, but I also want to start experimenting visually with different things that I can do later on, which for this case and in this moment means that I ended up working in a slightly different way. And don't get me wrong, I have more experiments planned that will again disrupt how I normally work, but those would be quite different to my usual processes in other ways, and they are also being left to a little bit later on, just so I can focus up one at a time. So yes, for now I work on finishing all of the background, and then it's the latter portion of the video that is dedicated to the character for the space. And that might be a little bit confusing. Now, I decided which way that I'd be working on the people and the background and which order I'd be doing that, based on the confidence of the design that I had. I have designed the character a few times, so there were really only one or two things left to truly work out with her later on. Well, truthfully, I have drawn her as a child more often than not, but it would be a fairly simple matter to age them up visually, just taking into account their life and different notes that I have about them. Still, I have drawn her like this once or twice otherwise, so I'm not working from entirely square one. But I still felt less certain about the background design, and I wanted to start there to kind of give more attention to it. So then, the concept for the background is an early but permanent castle sort of environment. It will be set at a time where they would have been able to solidify the castle and make it out of a more permanent material like stone, rather than anything wooden. But it wouldn't yet be overly large or fancy. It would still be a defensive movement to serve a purpose. This would also be taking into account that where this would be located, they would have plenty of wood and stone at their disposal to build up this sort of structure, alongside anything else that they would need nearby. For example, nearby they would have a settlement close to this, that would also then use similar materials in their homes. It by no means is the final and conclusive design for this area as a whole, especially with what I've drawn here. It is being used, however, to set the tone of the environment more than anything. Mainly by seeing how things would look with these materials on hand, by seeing what people would have access to from that point as well. It's also a test to see how I want to decorate this area, and if that would work, or if I want to change it to better match the tone, whether that be something as simple as changing the colours, or something more subtle. And the only reason changing the colours isn't considered subtle this time is because these colours are associated with the region, and specifically this group in this region. But in saying all of that as well, I also think that it worked for what I have in mind, so it is very plausible that this stays, or threads of this design here stay for the later parts. I actually think though that the more I talk about this, I might just have to refine a few points or work out how the rest of the building would work around this space as well. But in saying that, I have been considering all of that while sketching this section of the drawing, and kind of coming to decisions about this scene. Now though, before we look at the figure, I do want to briefly point out some of the other choices that I made within the background as well, as I do really love how this all turned out and came together. So the first of these choices had been the time of day for the drawing, and how I wanted to go about including that within this outcome. I mean, it's one of those details that kind of helps set a lot of the tone about the story going on behind it, and it was something rather simple to address. I wanted it to look as if this took place at night, or when it was dark at the very least, and there are multiple ways to go about achieving this effect as well. One of them is to use a blue multiply layer, and that is a pretty common way to go about it. The other one can be adding a bit of dark blue to most of the palette, and shading can go quite far as well. However, I have recently been looking more at using gradient maps, and how I could use that instead of simply sticking with what I know. I like the multiply approach, and I will likely still use it a lot in the future. Yet I sometimes find that it works a bit too well, or it darkens things a little bit too much. I sometimes will be able to do it without even needing a blending layer set to it, just a dark blue hue, and that would also work. But again, the same issues come into play if it working with a one-size-fits-all approach. So the shadows end up too dark and the highlights become muted and unseen under the final layer, which sometimes I like, and other times I just don't. This time, however, I used the gradient map to add the final hue. Well, setting it to a soft light blending mode as well and turning it basically all the way down also helped. It might look like there isn't any final effect from it, given that I do set it to about 20% opacity, but the effect is there and it is as subtle as I want it to be. Anything higher kind of took over a bit too much and it shifted the shadows in ways I just wasn't a fan of. But I also like this newer approach. I know that I could use any blending mode for it for a slightly different effect, and if I feel like it, I also could just leave it as an ordinary layer entirely and just lower the opacity for it. But the way the gradient map works, for those who may not know, it accounts for various tones in the image and matches a colour to that in the gradient, so that it ends up colouring tones rather than setting everything to a single value. That means that, when looking at the image overall, the darkest shadow and the lightest highlights aren't flattened to a middle point, which was the issue previously, and I kind of have more control over how the final effect turns out. I can set things lighter or darker where needed to, without having to balance everything else in a single motion, or, as I did a few times before, manually use a spray tool to map out lighter and darker sections that could still take forever and still not be quite right. I think for this one I would give the gradient map a fairly decent score now that I am getting used to it. Maybe an 8 out of 10 total for the tool as a whole, as there is still quite a few things for me to work out about it. This use in particular I might round up to a 9, as that seems quite fair. So then, there are a lot of details left to talk about, but I think I can maybe mention one more before I have to move on to the characters' conversations. Unfortunately, there is obviously a lot that I could say. I could talk about the stone detailings, I could talk about the carpet, the curtains, or even the little bits of environment hinted outside the window. But I have about enough time for one, so I will have to pick one. And despite a lot of the work being done accidentally off camera, I actually want to mention the banners by the door. See, I did about 95% of this drawing, and then I realised that I needed a snack before wrapping up the final details, such as the banner's actual pattern. Part of the issue, and the reason I did this, was because I have a sense of what the regions would put on their banners, their flags, almost, yet never actually laid it out until this moment, so I did need to confer with my notes just to double check what I wanted it to be. I also figured that, before I got into all of this, I would go and get a snack before I forgot about that and then come back to it after a little bit of movement, as I had been sat down for quite some time. And I did it all as well. But then I realised when I was done with the banners that I hadn't recorded a single second after the snack, which hardly surprised me at the time. Maybe a little bit bothersome, sure, but also not the end of the world since it was only a couple minutes back and forth. The character is far more interesting to work on and watch the process of, but I did add the pattern of the banner to the back, between where I show it and the end now. It was fairly straightforward though, as I might have said. There'd been a couple of minutes going back and forth whilst I worked out exactly what I wanted it to look like, but that also worked itself out for me pretty quick the longer I stared at it. The place that this area is in and the people who live here are commonly connected to the motif of fire and the sun specifically. They then connect together quite well, and, on a vertical banner especially, there is space enough for the both of them to sit comfortably together. And especially, which was one of my main concerns, in a pattern that was simple and makes sense within the world as well. It is reasonable that they're able to make these banners, is what I mean by that. I also want to note here about the banners that the sun, by design, can also be interpreted as a flower, given how I tend to draw those as well. It was an accidental part of the design that I chose to intentionally keep once I saw it though, as flowers, whilst they are a bit more opposite to fire, also sit well with the values of this region and the messages that they would live by. It may not be what those outside of them would know these people for, especially at this point of the history, but I also quite like that detail too, so I thought that it could stay. It also lets me explore how this banner may evolve with these people, which I am excited to get a start on as well the more that I look at this area, region, and the stories that unfold here. But all of that said, let's actually turn our attention now to the character here. As you might be able to see, she isn't exactly our idea of human. And, well, you would be right by that. She isn't exactly the world's idea of human either, which is rather key to her storyline in this era that she lives in, and especially the details that are quite key to her design that make her herself and not someone else. Now, I will note that in my world building, I have a rather simple magic system that affects the world in different and far more complicated ways. I use this system to sort of explain some of the less natural details to our world, such as unique hair and eye colours, since I want to give myself a range to work within that's a bit more outside of our own. However, I also didn't want to limit myself to just people and humans, and that felt boring to do anyway, so I included a few different options found across the world, but also mixed in between each other. So what I mean by this isn't there isn't one specific region of the world where the elves live. They are found within everywhere and with other people. See, even within one group as well, there are also notes already about variations and the ways appearances may differ. So, the world building as a whole gives me quite a lot to work with straight off the bat. So, yes, she isn't human, but her design isn't too different from what I could do for a human of the world as well. The main defining thing that shows her as not human are the horns and tail. And a human wouldn't have those, but they could have the pink hair or the red eyes in this world, given how the magic is meant to work. Okay, maybe in the early era that she exists within, it would be a little bit unusual, but it wouldn't be unheard of, just a bit rare. Now, looking at her design specifically, it did make me actually question part of the world building with what would look good and what sounded good. See, I had a note where her species? Or race? I don't know what term to use here since I hear both of them used in fantasy settings for this purpose. But either way, she would have a physical sign of age where the whites of her eyes may, but not always, darken over time. Again, it would depend on a few other factors of the person, such as where they were from, and also other traits of appearance that they may have, but most of the time, I figured it would be an interesting way to tell age, and it would also be interesting how it might work within the world itself. Then I go to draw here, and because I am kind of used to drawing her as a child, I put in the pale whites of the eyes, and I continue on. But then I remember the detail as I had the notes open to the side, and I did have to debate if that would look good for this character. It isn't a detail central to the world, so if I didn't like it, I am aware that I could change it so that only a minority might have this change within this group. But I kind of set it aside before making any major changes, and I continued on to the rest of the character. By the time I came back to it, I liked the darker detail, and realised that I just needed to slightly alter it a tiny bit before I was truly entirely happy with it and ready to move on. Now though, this isn't the only detail of the character either. I had quite a bit to work out with this character as well, mainly things like the subtle armour details to her outfit, which I did choose to keep minor for this outfit, yet I wanted it to be present to indicate that she might not be entirely peaceful. It was then the colour of the dress, a red chosen to match what the area is known for, and also the little details here that help her feel more included in the world that I am making as well. I am aware that I could have made her entirely armoured, but that also didn't fit the era of this character that I kind of envision for her. When she was fighting, she wouldn't have been able to afford armour, and in this era it wouldn't have been anything fancy or advanced, and I do think that this time is quite early compared to the other stories that I have in the works at the moment. She would have then been younger, and it would have been a cost that she couldn't afford, so she wouldn't really be armoured all that often. Then at this era, the armour may be a little bit better compared to when she was younger, and also something that she would be able to have. But the physical fights that she would be directly involved with would have decreased, and she would also be used to not relying on it. I might later design a set for her if it proves needed, but for this instance, the armour needed to only be implied minorly. It was actually more important though that I tied her in with the motifs of the area around her, which is then why I focus more on the ribbon or the belt tied around the waist, and also the details at the neckline of her dress. I decided to decorate both of them with the sun and flame pattern that tie in again with the pattern on the banner, and it kind of makes sense since she is wearing the colours of the banner as well. In a way, I almost wanted her to be inseparable from the motifs for the moment. They are on the sword, the dress, and in the environment that she remains within. I didn't want her overly annoyed as a facial expression, especially if she is within her own castle, as if she is within her own castle, then she's likely to be more amongst allies than enemies. Yet I didn't want it to seem that she was entirely calm either. There is still likely a lot that she's dealing with, so she would be a little bit stressed. And she's still holding the sword for a reason as well, even if she is posing a bit more with it than maybe using it. Again though, I didn't want it to look like active combat. Finally though, I also didn't want her to look silenced or quiet. I didn't want her mouth closed, as I wanted it to be as if she is the one talking rather than anyone else. She might be addressing those off the image or talking to herself, but she isn't just stood there silently. There is something going on, there's more to the image than what meets the eye. And yes, I'm aware that all of this seems quite strange for the moment. She is entirely too large for the scene, the scale is thrown off majorly, and the drawing just doesn't make sense. And that is partly why I work on these two entirely separately. But again though, that is intentional, and at the end when they are both put together properly, it will look like how it's always intended to look, without it being off or iffy as it may be now. I have more than one use for this character after all, and this drawing of the character, and I simply needed her to be a bit higher quality than I would have otherwise been able to draw her if I had been working to scale of the image. It's one of those things where it's always easier to scale down when drawing rather than scaling up, given loss of quality and other such reasons that happen during an increase. So for this instance and in this case, I drew her larger than she needed to be, and I saved her separately from the background as I needed to, so I can use it for multiple purposes. And I kind of enjoyed doing that this time. I also kind of want to note here that I know her design isn't the most detailed in the world, especially since I'm drawing her separate from everything else. It makes sense that I would have been able to include more detail in this case compared to what I would normally do. But that just didn't suit this character in particular. I like how simple the design turned out, with it still having that little touch that the other designs this era just don't have. There's little details such as the belt and the sash which would have taken a lot of time to make in this era of the world, and would be worth more than we might hold it value for. There's things like the armour that's specifically made and more detailed than again the armour might be for this time, so it kind of makes more sense that she is of a position of power, if you know the world. And it's one of those things where I enjoyed adding those little details without going overboard. I could have easily spent ages adding in little designs and buttons and this, that, the other. But it wasn't needed for this character. I like the mix of simplicity and how it adds to the story. It's simple, yes, but she still has the nod of the character and the environment around her more specifically. But for now though, that is all we have time for this week. I have really enjoyed this, and I have been so motivated to work on this and everything else at the same time that it's almost been refreshing lately. Last week I shared a game for the first time on the channel, a new survival world in Minecraft for anyone who hasn't seen that. And that little sense of variety has been enough to diversify what I'm working on, enough that I can get more done at a single time, without having to worry too much about what I'm doing or what I want to do next. And also kind of taking away most of the risk of burnout or losing ideas and momentum. I worked on this whilst I did that, and I've done about 20 different things whilst I did this, since I have been enjoying having multiple things to work on at a time. Besides, working on this has gotten me more ideas to put into the world, and it has helped me identify a few areas that might need changing slightly, kind of as I go along in the process. But it has, more importantly, also helped me with ideas of who this character is, and what this area of the world is like overall as well. It's given me ideas for how it might grow, how it might change, different events of the history that I've been struggling to work out for quite some time now. And it's just kind of given me more motivation to look at everything wider as I want to. Don't get me wrong though, it was a little bit of back and forth, especially in the design phase and working out what I liked and what I didn't. But I also like what I might be able to do with this now, and I have banked the ideas that I didn't use for this one for elsewhere in this region, or other regions entirely. I mean, who knows, it might fail miserably and I just keep it as a single still image and call it a day. I might decide not to even try the experiment, which I don't know why I wouldn't try the experiment, but I might decide that it won't work, and move on. But it might work, and it also might give me a new approach to work with and prove promising. It might give me the nudge to try the next experiment and then the next, and kind of continue building on these skills. As this is the first hurdle of breaking my normal work routine. This one is making me think about drawing the characters separate, and also what goes on behind them, and all these normal things that I wouldn't have to really concern myself with on a normal drawing on day to day. But that's all part of the drawing, and that's what I love about it. And I will have to see all of that later and kind of come to conclusions as I go forward with it. Right now I can only really speculate for what I'm going to do with it. But again though, I don't mind that. For now though, thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you have a great week going ahead. This is where I will be leaving it for today, so I will see you next time, and goodbye!